I am Tess Marchant-Shapiro. I'm the University Writing Director. I'm a professor in the Political Science Department, but I teach research methods, which means that I spend a lot of time teaching my students how to read a scholarly article, and it's really tightly connected to the way that I teach writing as well. So just a preview of where we're going to be going tonight. The focus is on how to read and understand at the end of the reading. We'll start by talking about why academic articles are so confusing. Then I will present to you cognitive framework theory, as it's a theory, a psychological theory on how people learn that I use both in writing, but it really helps you figure out how to read more effectively so that you can understand it. Specifically, we will cover how to use pre-reading to build a foundation for understanding what you're going to be reading in the article. We will walk through the process of what I call read 3 to read and understand a scholarly article. And then at the end, I'm going to ask for your takeaways on it. Specifically, I'm going to ask you, what is the most important thing you learned tonight? So if something really strikes you as useful or important to remember, just write it down because I'm going to be asking you at the end. So the problem. We read scholarly articles, and a lot of times we start reading them and they just sound like a whole ton of gobbledygook. And I know, I don't know about you, I know when I read scholarly articles, I will frequently get like 5 or 10 pages in, and I literally will fall asleep. And I'm not sure how much of it is it's boring or how much of it is just this cognitive overload, but I just can't take anymore. So that's the problem we're dealing with. This is my nightmare. I don't know about you guys, but here I am in my 60s. I still have nightmares about being in college and the awful things that happen. The worst is always is the end of the semester and it's finals time and I have never gone to the class. But the second worst nightmare that I still have on occasion is that it's the beginning of the semester and I walk into a classroom, I sit down, and the professor starts to teach, and it's Chinese. And I can't understand a word. And it is so intimidating. So how would it feel? I don't know if you had the nightmare, but maybe the actual thing has happened to you. How do you feel when you walk into a classroom and it makes no sense at all to you? Marian's putting her hair up. It's like this. It's scary. It's intimidating. You don't really want to leave because that's embarrassing. But at the same time, you can't understand. And the professor comes up to you and repeats the same thing over and over again, and you have no clue. They can say it however many times they want, but you will never understand that my name is whatever. What is your name? Because you have no background for it. And so the problem is, if we want to understand, we've got to have a foundation in order to understand. So what is it that makes foundations so important for learning?
Can you hear me, Tess?
I can, Marianne. If you can speak up a
I
little, I'd
think
appreciate it.
it's like cracking the code. Like the
Yeah,
foundation helps navigate.
we need the combination. We need a key, right?
Yeah.
So this is I'm going to be using this same article all night tonight. Which is a really important article in the things that I study. So this is the beginning of that scholarly article. So you sit down to read an article, think about how you feel. In this paper, the concept of social capital is introduced and illustrated. Its forms are described, the social structural conditions under which it arises are examined, and it is used in an analysis of dropouts from high school. Use of the concept of social capital is part of a general thing, and how does it feel when you read all of those terms?
I feel like I need a definitions, like in a workbook or something, it's got definitions at the back.
Yeah,
that
and it's
this
crazy because
article,
this is the introduction, but
yeah, this
somehow
article
the
needs
language,
to
and there
define
really
a
aren't any
term, right?
words in
Yeah.
there that you don't know. But the way it's put together, a lot of the words obviously have technical meanings that you need to have before you read. But that all just gets very confusing and very, actually, I think, intimidating. You start to wonder, am I up to this? You guys are graduate students, and you're supposed to be becoming part of the professional discipline, becoming colleagues with your professors, and you read something like this, and it's just so defeating. It feels like, oh, I'll never get up to that level that I'm supposed to get to. And so the problem is language, but it's more than just the language. It's that background. We need some kind of key to understand what's going on in it. So in building a foundation, it's not enough to have the exposure repetition, having a Chinese professor say over and over again in Chinese, my name is whatever, and what is your name? You'll never understand the word name. The repetition doesn't do it. And so I'm proposing that you think about reading scholarly articles from the perspective of cognitive framework theory. Again, 3 words that you know. Cognitive has to do with brain. Framework has to do with a structure. Theory, it's just a logical explanation of how the world works. Put them all together, then what does that mean? What are cognitive frameworks? They are mental structures that help us organize and interpret information. So if you think about a computer, computers have RAM, or random access memories. And you can keep adding a whole ton of information, that short-term memory on the computer, but it has limits. So I have this bad habit of copying pictures and pasting them into a document because I want to keep them all together, and I copy and paste, and I copy and paste, and I copy and paste. If I keep doing that long enough, like half an hour or so, all of a sudden the computer just stops. It'll start going slower, and then it will do nothing, and you can't get it to do anything until you literally have to turn the computer off and turn it on again. And in that turning it off, it erases that random access memory so that it can keep track of things again. So computers actually can keep track of a whole ton of information, but they do get overloaded. If you think about the human brain, way more limited than a computer, we really can only keep track of 3 to 5 bits of new information in our brain. And if we try and put more in it, you'll start losing track of the first few bits that you put in, but at some point your brain will just explode, which is why, I talked about, for me, I just fall asleep. It's because my brain is so overloaded, I cannot learn another thing. I cannot keep track of another thing. And so my brain says, oh, time to go to sleep and refresh yourself. We need a place, if we're going to be learning new information, we need a place to put that new information so that we can keep track of where it is all going, and our brains don't just explode from having too much new information. If you think about academic articles, you're reading it because there's a whole ton in your discipline that you don't know yet. And so usually in the academic article, there's not a lot of old information in there. It is almost entirely new information. It's way more new information than you can keep track of just by reading. And so we need to figure out how to build a structure so your brain knows you're going in this direction, but it can only have like 3 to 5 things in that structure to keep track of, or you'll just lose it. So I'm going to talk about using pre-reading as a tool to build that framework of 3 to 5 things that are coming in the article so that you can keep track of it and build up this capacity of understanding more and more new information. So there are two alternatives to reading an article. The first is the way we normally do it. We read it once and we spend the time and we go slowly and carefully because there's all these technical terms that we haven't met before, and we go and we search out the technical terms because that's what a good student does, and we keep getting it, and generally if you do that, read it slow and be careful and keep looking things up as you go, it can take you a couple hours just to get through an article, and usually by the end of it you're just dead and you really didn't understand much about what was in there. You might be able to say what the topic of the article was, but you really didn't understand it. My alternative is this thing that I call the read three, where you're going to read it 3 times, but you're going to build structures as you read it. Start with a few things first and then build so that you can understand more and more. And by the end of it, you really understand. And in doing that, it sounds like reading it 3 times is going to be really time consuming. But the reality is that it's going to go a lot faster since you can only keep track of 3 new things. Reading it once, you hit a brick wall partway through. It takes hours to finish. You don't understand. You lose confidence in your own ability. Whereas with the read 3, usually you can read an academic article in 30 to 60 minutes, and you understand the point of the article, and by the end of it, you should be able to summarize and analyze the argument as well, which is actually the goal. When your professor assigns an academic article for you to read, they want you not only to understand it, they want you to be able to analyze the argument so that you can put it together with the other scholarly articles that you are reading. And seriously, you can do this in 30 to 60 minutes if you read it 3 times instead of just once. Sounds weird, but it's true. So how does the read 3 work? I don't know if you guys have kids or remember when you were a first grader. I remember when my kids were in elementary school, their kindergarten teachers, their first grade teachers had these big books. So the kids had their own copy of a book that was just, regular book size. Then the teacher would sit up in front of all of the kids in the class with the big book. And before they would start trying to read, this is when you were trying to learn to read or your kids are trying to learn to read, the teacher would look through the pictures in the book so that the kids would set up their expectations about what was the storyline, what was happening in the book, so that as they were reading, when they came across a word that started with a P, but they hadn't ever seen it before, they had already seen the picture and knew that the book was about peaches. And so they figured, oh, this is a P word. I bet that P word is probably peaches because the book is about peaches. And so you've got these expectations. And that's what the normally happens when kids are learning to read. The teacher will set up the expectations with a pre-reading of the book before you try to actually read the words on the page. Similarly, in Read 3, we're going to be reading an article 3 times to set up those expectations, to create the cognitive framework so that you can, over the course of those 3 times, figure out what it's all about. So the first read, you literally only read the title and the headings. The second read, you read the introduction and the conclusion because they're usually the most accessibly written of the sections in a scholarly paper. So normally you can read them without too much trouble. And then once you've done those 2 things, you've got the title and headings, you've read the introduction and conclusion, then you go back and you read the full paper. And you've got the framework so that full paper, even though it's still full of those technical terms and so forth, you pretty much can follow where it is going because you have a framework for it. So first read, you do the title. As you're looking at the title, you can usually identify the topic because it will normally be in that title. So that's what you're looking for with the title. Then you read the headings. And the purpose of reading the headings is to figure out how does the paper progress. It's sort of like the plot line of looking at the pictures. You know what's coming first, second, third, so you know where you're going as you start to read it. Then just as you're thinking of those headings, I want to do a sidebar here. In a scholarly article, it depends on your discipline, but each discipline has a structure to those headings that, if you are aware of it, will help you even more. So again, this depends on the discipline, but normally it will start with an introduction. The very first section, it doesn't necessarily have a heading, but in the introduction, the author you can look for the question that the author is trying to answer. Then will be the literature review. Some disciplines have this integrated into the introduction. My discipline of political science has a separate section, which is the literature review. What's going to be in there is, what are the scholarly answers to the question that the author is trying to answer. Some disciplines will then have a theoretical framework, which looks at what the worldview of the author is. My discipline doesn't do that. That would be incorporated into the literature review, but maybe your discipline has a separate section for that. Some disciplines have a separate methodology section, and this looks at what theories guide the data analysis, data collection. My discipline incorporates the methodology into the research design, so it doesn't have a separate section. That's why those two are in parentheses, because my discipline doesn't do it. Then will be the research design. How does the author collect the data? Then the data analysis. What patterns does the author see in the data? Some disciplines will, after the data analysis, have a findings section. How does the data support the author's hypothesis? And then I have never seen a discipline that does not have a conclusion, which is looking at how does that article inform our understanding of the world. So just knowing that this is the structure that my discipline uses in writing papers will help you as you go through those headings, of knowing that a specific heading is going to be the literature review and a different heading is going to be the research design, for example. Now, back to the second read. Once you've got this flow of the topic and how the topic is getting developed through the different sections, you go back to the beginning and read the introduction. And in the introduction, you specifically ought to be looking for, what is the research question? It should be in there somewhere, and it really helps you to know, where is the author trying to go? What is he curious about? Why is he collecting the data? What is he trying to answer? And so look for that in the introduction, and then skip to the conclusion. And in the conclusion, there ought to be something about what the author's answer to that research question is. And so then you've got the whole background to what the author is doing. Once you've done that second read, you know what they're curious about, and you know what they learned by doing this research. So that's a whole lot of background, so that when you go to the third read, you know where the author is going. You've got the framework entirely built in your mind, and so you can fill in all of the blanks. And so I would actually suggest skimming through the article, because it still is relatively easy to get bogged down. But just to skim through the article. If you encounter words you don't understand, I would definitely not stop reading to look them up at that point. I would just circle them and keep moving on and getting the flow. I don't know if you guys use Post-its. I love Post-its. It's a good idea to flag the tables and figures, because that's where the data is usually presented. And so once you finish reading it, you can go back and analyze the data in terms of the whole story that the author is telling. But you don't necessarily want to spend a whole lot of time doing that analysis when you're reading it through for the first time. Then once you've finished that skim through the entire article, that's the time to start thinking about what you've read. If any of the words that you circled seem important, then you can go look them up at this point. And usually those words you're curious about, you can easily just Google it, and it'll suddenly make a whole lot more sense to you because you've got the story that the person is telling in the article. And it's like, oh, now I know what they meant by that word. I would also highlight 3 to 5 sections or sentences that seem central to the argument. A lot of times when you're reading, you'll spend a whole lot of time on the literature review because that seems like the most interesting. But the literature review, because it's just the current scholarly answers to the question, that's all old information. And so that's not necessarily the point that the author is making. So I recommend for each of the sections, you might highlight a sentence that seems like the most important sentence in that section, and then you can look chronologically through those 3 to 5 sections or sentences that you highlighted, and you'll probably get a really good summary of the argument that's being made. And so then at that point, I would go back and underline one sentence that summarizes the point of the article. Usually this will be in the introduction or the conclusion. If you can't find a sentence that does a really good job of summarizing it, you get maybe three sentences together that sort of summarize it, then you can write your own sentence. But you want to have that one sentence because that really summarizes the point of the article. So at this point, you've finished your 3 reads, and you're in a position to do what your professor really wanted you to do to begin with. You've already done way more than you would have if you just read it once because you understand it a lot better. But the whole point of you as a graduate student or me as a faculty member doing research in reading scholarly articles is to analyze them and enough so that I can start putting them together and see where they contradict each other, where they reinforce each other, and so forth. But you've got to analyze each of the articles before you can start making those connections. And so the first question that I would ask is, what data did the author use? That will normally be in that research design section. Do the data support the conclusion? That will be in the data analysis section or the findings sections. And then take a step back. Does the argument make sense? Can the conclusions be applied to more general situations besides just this one situation of high school graduation rates? Does it tell me something about society more broadly? And once you've got this analysis done, then you're in a place to start making those connections that your faculty member really wants you to make. So now we're going to apply this read to the article that I had some passages earlier, and I'll just walk you through how I would do the read 3. So the article, if you want to look it up in JSTOR, I think if you click on the slide there, the JSTOR link should take you to that article if you'd like to open it. But the name of it is Social Capital in the Creation of Human Capital. So social capital is a concept originated by, actually in this article from Jim Coleman, who's a sociologist. It was popularized by a political scientist, Robert Putnam, but it's actually been applied in, I don't know how many disciplines, I think pretty much any discipline. And so this is really a fundamental article, and it's really, in comparison to academic articles, fairly accessible, but as we build the framework, it will make more and more sense to you. So we'll do the first read, which you'll remember, we'll look at the title in order to identify the topic, then we'll look at the headings to see how the paper progresses. So here is the JSTOR source code, whatever, for this article. And so the title is Social Capital in the Creation of Human Capital. It was written by Jim Coleman, published in the American Journal of Sociology in 1988. And so we've got the title is Social Capital in the Creation of Human Capital. And so the question that we ask from the title is, what's the topic? And the topic obviously is social capital. And then somehow it's connected to human capital, which is a concept that, predated Coleman. Human capital is talked about in business, in public forums in various ways. It's the stuff that you have in your brain that helps you when you have a job, things that you know that you're able to perform your job with. So somehow it's connected, that social capital thing is connected to our ability to do our job. So here, there's the second part of the first read is looking at the headings. The first section, it had an introduction that introduced where he was going with it, but then the first section with the heading was criticisms and revisions. And then social capital, you can bet that's going to be something about the literature review. Human capital and social capital is where he starts making the connection between those two concepts. And then there's a section on forms of social capital. One form of social capital, the subheading, is obligations, expectations, and trustworthiness of structures. And so there's some structures, social structures involved that have trust and obligation. So these are structures of, if it's social, it's structures between people. Another form of social capital is information channels, which suggests that our connection with other people, our social connections, give us information. And then the third form of social capital is norms and effective sanctions. So when we're in society, in groups, those groups that we're in have norms of behavior, rights and wrongs, along with some kind of punishment if we don't abide by those norms. Then the next major section is social structure that facilitates social capital. And so this section is going to be something about how the structures can be developed to build more social capital. The first subsection is about whether the social networks are open or closed, so they let other people in or they really are closed off from other people. And also there's something about the structure, appropriable social organization. Can we take the organizations that we are members of and use them in other ways or appropriate them? Then the next major section is social capital in the creation of human capital. And we've got two subsections, is family social capital and social capital outside the family. So something about the community influences our ability to create social capital and through it human capital. And then we've got public goods aspects of social capital. So something about social capital lets us build public goods. And then, of course, there's a conclusion. All right, so that's our first read. We've got an idea of how the article is going to flow. Then we're going to stop and read the introduction, and we're going to look for what's the research question, and then the conclusion, and what's the author's answer to the research question. So here is a copy-paste from the introduction to this article. There are two broad intellectual streams in the description and explanation of social action. One characteristic of the work of most sociologists sees the actor as socialized and action as governed by social norms, rules, and obligations. The principle, that sounds familiar, right? Do you remember there was a section in there that talked about social norms? The principal virtues of this intellectual stream lie in its ability to describe action in social context and to explain why action is shaped, constrained, and redirected by social context. So there's something that Coleman is thinking about as a sociologist, that the society, the groups that we're part of, explains how we act in society. The other intellectual stream, characterized by the work of most economists, so he started with sociologists, then he's going to economists, sees the actors as having goals independently arrived at, as acting independently and wholly self-interested. This is rational choice theory, which was the big thing in 1988 when he was writing this, but it's the way economists approach social questions. Its principal virtue lies in having a principle of action that of maximizing utility. This principle of action, together with a single empirical generalization, declining marginal utility, if you've taken an economics class, you've heard that, has generated the extensive growth of neoclassical economic theory, as well as the growth of political philosophy of several varieties: utilitarianism, contractarianism, and natural rights. In earlier works, I have argued for and engaged in the development of a theoretical orientation in sociology that includes components from both these intellectual streams. All right, we are to his question now. And the question is, can social capital as a concept explain individual behavior, like economists do, within a social context in the way that sociologists do? And so that's the question that he's starting with in that introduction. So now we know his question, we're going to move to the conclusion. And in the conclusion, we're going to look for what is the author's answer to his research question. In this paper, I have attempted to introduce into social theory a concept, social capital, paralleling the concepts of financial capital, physical capital, and human capital, but embodied in relations among persons. This is part of a theoretical strategy that involves the use of the paradigm of rational action, but without the assumptions of atomistic elements stripped of social relationships. I have shown the use of this concept through demonstrating the effect of social capital in the family and in the community in aiding the formation of human capital. The single measure of human capital formation used for this was what appears to be especially responsive to the supply of social capital remaining in high school until graduation versus dropping out. Both social capital in the family and social capital outside of it in the adult community surrounding the school showed evidence of considerable value in reducing the probability of dropping out of high school. And so that's where what he found. He found that individual social capital that develops in social contexts supports the development of human capital, such as a high school graduation and other public goods. So we now know what he was curious about, what his answer to his research question is. We're now at a place where we can actually skim through the article. And this is the point at which, if you encounter words you don't understand, you circle them and immediately move on. You flag the tables and figures. And then once you've finished, if any of the words you circle seem important, you look them up. You highlight the 3 to 5 sentences that seem central to the argument, and then conclude by underlining one sentence that summarizes the point of the article, or write one your own. So here are the key sentences I underlined, and it ended up being one sentence from each of those sections in that outline that we talked about earlier. There's one key sentence that is social capital inheres in the structure of relations between actors and among actors. There's another sentence that I highlighted that's just as physical capital and human capital facilitate productive activity, social capital does as well. A third sentence, both social capital in the family and social capital in the community play roles in the creation of human capital in the rising generation. And then a fourth sentence that I highlighted was the kinds of social structures that make possible social norms and the sanctions that enforce them do not benefit primarily the person or persons whose efforts would be necessary to bring them about, but benefit all of those who are part of such a structure. So after all of that, this is an article that you probably even haven't even heard of social capital before, but at this point, if we could, and I asked you, you probably could give me a pretty good definition of what social capital is and how it works. And by looking at that flow of those points that the author is making, I can go to the conclusion and find some sentences that really summarize the point of the article. In this paper, I've attempted to introduce into social theory a concept, social capital, paralleling the concepts of financial capital, physical capital, and human capital, but embodied in relations. You remember that. We just read that when we were reading the conclusion. This is part of a theoretical strategy that involves use of the paradigm of rational action, but without the assumption of atomistic elements stripped of social relations. That's 3 sentences, I think. I would put that into one sentence, which is social capital is a resource embodied in relations among persons that explains human behavior. So we've finished our 3 reads. We've got everything that we need to pull it together, and especially if we have Post-its on the tables, we can look through those and analyze the articles of finding. What data did the author use? Let me just skip and we'll answer these as we go. The data was graduation rates as a result of the amount of social capital in families and communities. Do the data support the conclusion? Yes, if you look at those tables that are in there, both families and communities with higher social capital have higher graduation rates. Does the argument make sense? Yeah, it makes sense that the strength of social structures influences the success of children. Can that conclusion be applied to more general settings? I already told you that this theory has been used in a whole ton of disciplines, but if you think about it, it makes sense that yes, there are many social issues that can be influenced by our ability to mobilize various networks. So I share that article with you not because you necessarily need to know about social capital, but as an example of how you are capable of going through an article. We just spent, 15 minutes on this article, and you really have a good idea of what it is, even though you actually didn't take the time to read the full article. So if you think about the process that I've taught you tonight on the Read 3, what are the most important things that you learned today?